Greetings. My name is Mcebisi. I'm the CEO and founder of Department Capital. We are your guide to building and sustaining a high-performance culture. Welcome to the Moments of Impact. The year is 2024. African countries across the East, West, North, and South are scheduled to elect their next president. As of January 16, the world leaders, some 2,500 delegates, have gathered at the World Economic Forum with the intention to rebuild trust. From where I'm sitting, the unemployment, youth unemployment, dare I say, is sitting at a staggering 52%. As a recruiter, I keep looking back at the mega trends that were predicted in 2010 for 2020. Yes, indeed, some did come to pass in our attempt to upskill, bridge the knowledge gap, to inform our community, educate about the new ways of working, critical skills that will be in demand. We asked Mr. Mcebisi Jonas to join us and to reimagine what the next could be. Thank you so very much, sir, for joining us. How do you do?
I'm good. Before I came here, I was good.
Here's a little insight into the man. He's the chairperson of MTN, author of After Dawn, Hope After State Capture. Let me borrow from him. In October 2015, the Gupta brothers offered me the position of Minister of Finance in exchange for 600 million. I felt a deep sense of loss and disorientation. I thought of the years that had spent for democracy. We lost our youth. We suffered at the hands of apartheid state. Now, we faced with the mafia state. I felt deeply disempowered. I felt like a puppet in a bigger game that I could not comprehend. I turned down the bribe and I navigated the months that followed in a state of incomprehension about the future of our country. My sense of mission did not wane during this time, but it was an intensely lonely period. I could only trust only a handful of people. Everything that I had held as sacrosanct for 45 years was suddenly disintegrated. I began to examine my basic assumptions about what democracy meant in South Africa, who we were as a nation. How did we reach this point?
Well, that's a question to me now. Well, I think there are a number of factors that led us to where we are, or where we were at that point, and I would argue that we still are. And then we could have a long debate, but I will summarize what my views are. I think the first is that if you lose the big picture, you probably get lost in the path. And I think if you go back to how we started and what we envisaged was to build a particular kind of society, but what we did was to get into an agreement, and that agreement had particular elements, and I outlined them in the books. It was an agreement that said that firstly, we bring all key stakeholders into a conversation and agree about the way forward. Secondly, you would accommodate and ensure that the poor and the unemployed are accommodated through a redistribution program. Two, that the elite, in the form of those who establish capital, they are accommodated because you create a very conducive investment environment. Three, you would ensure that the aspirant black elite is accommodated because you offer them opportunities through all sorts of schemes into the picture. But for that to succeed, there were a couple of conditions. The first is that you needed a strong government, efficient and ethical. two, you also need a growing economy. And the third one, which I think we underestimate, is that those who claim to represent constituency should, in truth, represent those constituencies.
In truth.
In truth, they should represent those constituencies. And I think what has happened over the years, you said, how did this all happen? What had happened all over the years has been the disintegration of the foundations of that agreement. The first is the economy did not grow. The second is that we have a redistribution program that probably is admirable by any standards, but there was corruption. Of course, we have succeeded in serving the black elite, but of course, a lot were excluded. So effectively, the base, and of course, government's capacity was completely annihilated in the process.
From a human capital perspective?
Again, maybe I should use the capability as opposed to capacity. There's a human side to it, there's a system side to it, there's also the regulatory side to it. All of those were completely undermined in that process. The human side also relates to the technical side. All of those were undermined in the process. I mean, we destroyed the security structures of government. The prosecution authority was destroyed by just removing all the competent people in there. The police was destroyed. The police capacity of policing was destroyed. And of course, in critical areas, probably at the time we wrote the book, it's probably Treasury was still strong, maybe, and Reserve Bank was still, Central Bank was still strong, and maybe the tax authority was in trouble, but it was still had capacity. The point I'm making is that the state and the state capacity and capability was central to the success of the project. The growth of the economy was central to the success of the project, of the post-apartheid project. And thirdly, having representatives that in truth represent the constituencies they claim to represent is fundamentally important for this thing. Now, if you think about it, we arrive at a situation where more than 40% of eligible voters don't vote. So whom are you speaking on behalf? And the number has been decreasing over the years, and so on and so on. So that's, I think, the situation where we are, and that's the basis that pushed us to where we are.
In our attempt to rebuild and reimagine, you speak a lot on the After Dawn about we could get better. In fact, you're as confident as we'll get through it, but will we thrive is a question that we're all asking ourselves. There's certain characteristics that one has to develop to lead. What do you think makes for a good leader?
You know, again, I mean, it's a topic that I always talk about, but also share to talk about also, because I think at a time when there's paucity of leadership, there's a lot of talk about leadership. I mean, how many books are being generated about leaders and leadership and how to build leaders and that kind of stuff. But in simple terms, I mean, again, I say in simple terms, leadership is a crisis that we have. I mean, if you ask yourself the question, if there is a crisis today, which one voice can we listen to? And the truth is, you would actually probably end up generating a couple of names, and you won't have a single voice that South Africa can hear around. Leadership, I think, is for me, I mean, I kind of, again, borrowing from a whole range of writers, Frank Furedi and so on and so on. It's not something that you read from books. It's not a product of training programs as such, really. I mean, it is, in a sense, an experiential, developmental concept, really, that is born out of experience and so on. That's how the learning happened. It was also built on the basis of the network you keep and your associations and that kind of stuff and so on and so on. That's what really grew leadership. It's also built on how you internalize certain principles. You ask yourself, you ask the question, what are the key attributes for leadership? I know that you've 10 habits of leadership and this, but I think if you simplify, I lean a lot to Frank Furedi, you have three, I think, fundamental attributes. And the first is the capacity to initiate. You cannot call yourself a leader if you can't initiate anything, you jump on cats and cars that are moving. and you can't initiate anything on yourself. The capacity to initiate is fundamental. I can come back to it and talk about it. But the second element is the capacity to develop a presence.
Ooh.
Now, if you can't have a presence, and the presence is not a product of the position you occupy.
Ooh.
So people sometimes
Hold
walk in.
on. That's Mike. Say that again.
The presence is not a product of the position you occupy. It is not. You can have a big position, whether it's a minister, whether it's a CEO, whether it's a president or whatever, bishop, whatever, but not have a presence. Presence is just bigger than the position you occupy. And presence, fundamentally, in my view, is linked to you personifying the cause you stand for. And again, I'm saying, Freire goes on and talk about the area. But I think it's an age-old thing that leaders must have a presence. And they must develop that presence also.
And this presence is not bought.
It's not bought. You don't buy the president, you don't buy votes. That's why I think the democratic process, the crisis of the democratic process at the moment, is that it doesn't necessarily create leaders with presence.
How do we develop that presence?
I'll come back to that. But it's the third element of attribute of leadership is also I would argue, its capacity to make judgment, to make proper judgment call. For me, if you think about it, leadership in many ways revolves around those three attributes. Capacity to make judgment is also difficult in these days. Because again, in order to be able to make judgment, you need discretion. And I think in a rules-based world, discretion is becoming less important.
And to make discretion, you need character.
You need character, you need all of the above, you need ability to initiate, and of course you need a presence. People will look at you and follow what you say because they think you represent and personify what you're talking about. And if you think about it, those three factors are what, in my view, characterize the crisis of leadership in that we have across sectors of society.
You spoke about making decisions. How long does it take for you to decide?
It depends what the issues are. Let's face it. Part of the problem we have in many instances is that there is almost an ethical, philosophical frameworks and foundations that you need to have to be able to take the right decisions. So part of growing and experiencing and dealing with people, you actually build that arsenal, ethical and moral and philosophical arsenal that helps you, to kind of throw into situation, and you can actually use that arsenal as your basis and analyze the situation, then you come up with decision. The problem, of course, is in many instances, if you take politics as my favorite subject, is that modern politics are increasingly devoid and denuded of the philosophical and principle basis. So you have, I would use the term, depoliticization of politics. Because politics, if you think about it, when I say you are left, I'm right, I'm centrist, and so on, fundamentally, historically, that used to define that I have a philosophical orientation, a world view. If I ask you, few leaders, and say, what is their head world view? You can't see, but they present it themselves. And that's where I think the crisis of leadership begins. So that philosophical, ethical, moral foundation that actually becomes part of your essence is what I think is missing in modern politics. So what is the difference between party A and party B? Historically, you would say the one is left, the other one is right. The one that is right, because this is what they stand for. The one that's left, this is what they stand for. We have an experience in South Africa where different parties occupy different positions. They have cities run by this party, cities run by that party, and so on and so on. If you do an analysis of what is the difference, you probably will come to the same conclusion that there's very little difference. Why? It's because increasingly the essence of politics is taken out of politics. The principles, the philosophical orientation, and how you build aspiration for society into your process is disappearing very fast. So, I mean, that's why members are bought, members are transported to events, and that's, I think, is depoliticization. It is about Mcebisi Jonas saying, I am Mcebisi Jonas. Even now, many people will stand up and go to the president. Boop, he's the president. The question is, and if you really read into what people are saying, is the basis for them being president, you'll probably be surprised that there's very little difference. And that's, I think, the crisis.
That scares me. In the book, you speak about popularism being a thing. You chant certain slogans, you have a position, you pick a problem, and you make a noise about it. You back it up with marketing and all the digital media that allows us to reach far beyond. But what's the responsibility of leadership in our country?
I guess, I mean, I think part of what our responsibility is that we recognize that we have a diverse country and that we have a project to build a South African nation. And to build that South African nation, you need both an ethical and material basis to do that, which means you have to ensure that you create a common set of beliefs that define us as South Africans and promote that in your leadership style, but also ensure that our access to opportunity is equal, and you therefore deal with issues of inequality, not in a populist way, but in a real, a deep and thoughtful way than we are doing now. Understand the importance of education in that process, because I think we underestimate how important it is ensuring that the kids from poor families get good education. We actually underestimate the importance of that to an extent that, I mean, sometimes I feel education becomes a football. The reality is that if you do not ensure that you build into the system and understanding that poor kids from poor families get good education, what you have as social policy is a dual system. If you come from the township or rural areas, you go to rural school, to township school, and in the labor market, you get into particular segments of the labor market. If you come from the suburbs and what have you, you go to particular schools and it places you in a particular level. If you're sick, you go to particular segments of the health system. And so we're building a dual social system. I say you continue in the trajectory, that becomes your ticking time bomb for stability.
The responsibility
that's the
of
challenge.
corporates. You speak about it, and I do think that everybody should read After Dawn. You might need a master's in economics, but if you're like me, a dictionary will do. But for every turn, you're going to need to consult somebody just to get a better understanding. Certainly the answers are here. And Mr. Jonas has gone into detail about each of the 4 pillars that you speak about: inequality, politics, growth, on the basis of attributes that one has to develop in politics or private and public sector. Who do I need to become to navigate this fast-paced world? Sometimes as a black female, I feel like I don't belong. Sometimes I feel like I can't influence my ideas to be adopted because of my age, and despite the fact that in Africa the median age is 19 years old, I feel like I'm not ready. Who do I need to be to say I can lead?
Look, I mean, I guess, there are no technical answers to those questions, to be honest. I mean, there are no, I mean, if you ask, I hardly consider myself to be a leader anyway. But the point I'm making is that the essence of leadership is that you must recognize leadership across the board. And I think in all of us there is leadership. I mean, you leading in the way you're doing your stuff, and there are people who look up to you, and there are people who take your view on many other issues, and so on and so on. And you can't have a system that generates followers. We need to build leaders, not followers. That's where strong leadership is. I mean, the guys you work with now, they are looking after you. In 5 years, You would want them to be as confident as to a point where they can sit in your chair and do what you're doing, as it were. And I think that's the attitude that we have. And if you go back and say, where do you come from? You realize that actually you started in your leadership role when you were young. When you were playing with other kids, you started showing them what to do. You started establishing your own presence. You started initiating things, as it were. I'm saying the absence of that process, and if you can't, as a society, nurture that process where our kids go through that, we all go through that on a continuous basis, and so on and so on. The other problem is that, I always say that look at your heroes. The youth's heroes, and you know where the society is likely to go. And if you think about it, like pause a little bit and say, if you pick up 5 youthful guys and say, who are your heroes? As they tell you who their heroes are, that is an indication where society is likely to land. So I think and again, every danger and propensity that the youth is likely to repeat the blunders of the elders. So how do you break that chain? For me, it is, we have a big opportunity because the world is transitioning. We're going into a techno-economic framework, models now of economy. Technology is becoming more important. Digitization is becoming key. And we don't need to travel to the US to know what's happening. We don't need to, you know what I mean? So I think we need in our education system, in corporate, to actually start running programs that exposes our youth to the world. But also we need to have a program that ensures that our youth doesn't sit in South Africa. They go out into the world and learn from other jurisdictions about what people are grappling with and so on and so on. Because that experience is important for building and consolidating what we're doing. We must also have programs that ensure that, well thought through programs, ensuring that we take poor kids into schools overseas and elsewhere, and education to be exposed to different forms of learning, to different cultures, and so on and so on and so on. So there has to be an effort that is bigger than the structural, systematic thing that we're doing. But more importantly, I think, we have no choice in South Africa. We have to build an active citizenry to get out of where we are. If you are a professional in this sector or that sector, you need to look at what the policy challenges, what are the blockages for success in the sector, and start linking up and talk about these things and so on and so on. Because I think we can't, and we have a problem because of big politics and big economics. So South Africa is an interesting country because when you go to politics, big political parties, it's like determine what happens.
Yeah.
And they determine, and again, huge companies.
Absolutely.
Determine what
Usually
happens.
5 of them. At most they might be 6.
Determine what happens. So I think so activism of citizenry helps to bridge that gap and ensure that you have dynamized social dialogue.
So we must speak up.
Even amongst ourselves. Because I think the kind of conversation you have with others, but also not just speak up, but organize. So it would be good to have sectors that are well organized, well focused in ensuring that the sector thrives, but also build the skills as we do that. I don't think South Africa is a kind of black hole. I'm very optimistic, but I'm also realistic that we will go through a crisis.
In the book, you speak about having a national agenda. In no particular order, what would your agenda be?
I guess the first part of what we need to think about is that we need to kind of take a second look at the political system. Because I think if you tell me this today, how do you feel represented in the political system? And all of us will say, actually, not sure. And I guess that has to do with the system itself. Let's get some momentum to change the political system deal with the electoral system, but also push citizens into a bit more activism and conscious about their rights and what needs to happen, etc. So that's one part. If you pack that, the agenda then, for me, becomes one, creating a more capable state. In a country with inequality as South Africa, the state becomes very important. And it's important that it has to be efficient. It's important that it has to be focused on the right things and not be driven by all sorts of things. As it were, but it has to be focused on the right things. And secondly, you have to have a state that is agile. Because I think part of modern states' capacity is going to be determined by the extent to which, first, they deal with basic needs in education and health and so on, and security. But secondly, the extent to which they leverage broader society in a particular direction. In other words, if the state, we don't, so some people talk about South Africa, about the National Development Plan, and you can go out of the street and ask the person, do you know what National Development Plan? They will say, what, National Development, what? And they don't know. Because it's not something that has been sold to the state, to the country. It's not a product of societal process. It is a plan that government has hashed for itself. By the way, they've done so many plans after that to show that there is no even seriousness about that. So you need a process that at least ensures that everybody buys into this common vision, at least about where we need to go. And on the economic front, I think inclusion is fundamental. But you can't separate inclusion from growth. And in South Africa, they have this debate about growth and inequality. The truth of the matter is that you're not going to have sustainable growth without dealing with inequality. You're not going to deal with inequality without growth. So we need to kind of frame this.
They always have to happen simultaneously.
Simultaneously and feed into each other, as it were. So that's why I think you have parties in South Africa that will speak loud on inequality and reducing inequality, and others that speak loud on growth. The truth of the matter is that they should be speaking loud on both and actually integrating that in their conception of what the future should look like. And the last point, obviously, I think we undermine education. It should be our obsession. Education should be an obsession, and particularly education for poor kids, for kids from poor families. When I look at, the vast areas of the country, former Bantustan areas, etc. The thing that if you look back, they part of things that used to be buzzing is education. There used to be centers for education, for health, and so that is dead. That is so dead. It's not funny, and it's not about matric numbers. For some people think that this thing is about matric numbers. Actually, ultimately, the test of education is the ability of the individuals and human beings we're building to sustain themselves in life, and that entails two things. One, it's being able to get into the labor market. The second one, it means being able to cope with change. And that's what education should actually focus us on, basically. And I don't think at the moment, we're doing great.
Absolutely not.
We're not doing great.
I could even concur and suggest that as a professional, 20%, if not a bit more, 30%, should be on educating yourself about improved ways and researching about how you could get disrupted as an accountant, as a lawyer, how for IR it is here. It might make your role redundant. And the only way to make sure you don't become redundant is if you do upskill. You do get curious. I guess education is curiosity.
It is building that also.
You get asking questions. You call me and say, I need to speak to Mr. Mcebisi because I'm an HR director at this particular company and we have CSI and we're trying to redistribute funds. Or what sector should we be looking at? What should our policies be looking at? I think we need to interrogate everything that is happening. The policies, be it that you're at a particular company, that have been written at a different time. Think about the ambience in 1994 versus the ambience in the country in 2023. It's completely different. And if you are still implementing policies that were written at a different time, I do think that you've got a room to kind of say, what could I be doing better? What legacy could you leave? Incorporate where you are with your spend and your budget, going back to solving the issues that Mr. Mcebisi speaks about. And that's education. And I am truly for education. That's the game changer. How do we influence for our ideas to be adopted?
Well, again, I mean, I think, I mean, firstly, I think it's not all doom. I want to say that. I mean, I think I get encouraged, I mean, by some of the youth activities at the moment. I mean, you've got professional organizations, youth organizations. They're venturing more in politics. I mean, and when I say venture in politics, I'm not talking about, you've got a kind of, South Africa is interesting in the sense that you're in a transition. The generation that's running the country needs to begin to give way to a new generation to take over and so on and so on. That's a very sensitive space to be in. Are we managing it well? I don't think so. And I think that's something that I think we need to do. I think that most corporates are doing pretty well in terms of being conscious about integrating youth views into their own programs and, of course, professional input into their program as it were. I think what we do need to deal with is the national narrative. I mean, that's what my worry is. I mean, the national narrative is negative, is divisive, sometimes racist, and sometimes it's populist in many, and the national psyche is worrying. So I guess if you think about where leadership comes in at a national level, it is changing the narrative. We need to change the narrative. And some people say, no, let's change the narrative and make it just positive. Let's just be positive. It's more fundamental than that. It is about getting into the roots and saying, how do we change society? How do we begin to create hope amongst the youth, hope amongst the elderly, amongst everybody, basically, amongst women? Because again, that's another problem in South Africa. I mean, the women, I think the gender question, I always assume that we've taken such an elitist view on gender relations. I mean, fundamentally, gender relations are also linked to class relations in a very real sense. So we need to kind of build all of those into some narrative, new narrative for the country. But fundamentally, getting to a point where we have a new vision for the country.
One vision?
One vision for the country.
I'd be interested to find out from you guys, if you had to choose what our vision for the country would be, please comment below and let us know. Do you recall a moment that most impacted your career, other than October 2015?
I guess, I mean, I think it's almost like multiple points, you know, like, I mean, that kind of impact on what you do. The day we took a decision that we're leaving the country was a very momentous day. It affected me in many ways, because I think that's the time when you get independent, cut ties with everybody, go and start afresh. But again, I mean, coming back, I think the biggest reality check was that the world is big. I mean, is bigger than politics. Because I mean, grew up saying, politics is, and I think the biggest education post 94 for me, when we got into post 94, I suddenly realized that actually, coming from a liberation movement, I must recognize that, and all of us, of course, must recognize that you move from being a leader of society to being something that articulates the aspiration of society and therefore accountable to society. And if you think about what is the core problem in South Africa at the moment, is that I don't think we've actually transitioned. There is still arrogance, ethical and moral arrogance, that actually think that we've liberated you. So we are it. And I think there has to be humility built in leadership to begin to understand that you are ultimately servants of the people. And therefore accountability is at the core of what you need to do. I don't think we're there. But I think the post-94, if there's been any transformation and change, has been to grapple with kind of shifting your thinking as much as possible to appreciating the depth of requirement for accountability, that you are in a different role. And I mean, liberation movements all over the world fail, collapse, just on that point, because I mean,
Accountability.
that just understanding that you're no longer just a leader of society, but you are also a servant of society, accountable to society. If you think about it, most post-liberation countries, they fail with the concept of state president, because people think that the state president is the president of the liberation movement. They don't realize that state president is bigger than just like... So when you look at the state president, you're actually thinking that you're talking about a party leader in State House.
Yeah.
When you say, or you think you see looking at the minister,
Yeah.
you think that the minister is just a party activist in Pretoria.
Yeah.
That when in fact I think that's bigger than that. I mean, and therefore, much as you have to influence it as the system does, but you must also appreciate that they've got a responsibility far bigger than what it is. I mean, it's becoming common now. How do the terms of our presidents end? We tell him that the party tells him you have to resign. What does he do? He resigns. Constitution says it is Parliament that elects a president. So Zuma told to resign, he resigns. Because fundamentally it's a conceptual problem that almost flies against the Constitution. Because indeed the Constitution says you are a state president, the state president is a process, you go to Parliament, you elect the state president. And I assume that if you want to remove a state president, vote him out in Parliament. Because it seems simple, but it has fundamental kind of indicators of where the fault lines could be.
And I think what's most disheartening is when the courts say you have to leave. As a citizen, I worry if there's a continuation. I see it in corporate. Every time a new leader assumes a role, we know that there's going to be a restructuring, and then in that 8 months there's no movement. If they're going to restructure and get rid of people, as Section 189 is kind of instituted, then that kind of takes about a year, but nothing is happening. But because the brands are so good and the lack of competition that you speak about, we kind of continue buying the brands, they continue making money, but the urgency of change is not pronounced.
I mean, if you think about it, some of the changes might be necessary, but I think we need to actually value Constitution and understand what it stands for and try to actually follow it, and promote it in a way, in all manner of ways. And I think part of it is what I'm saying. A state president is a state president, at least try to ensure that it remains as such. Like a minister is a minister and try to remain as such, the minister of the state. That's why many countries will end minister of the state, as opposed to saying, countries are so sensitive, saying minister of trade and industries, minister of state trade and industry. You know what I mean? And that's important.
Accountability. How can we hold those that lead us accountable?
Look, there are simple ways, which is enshrined in regulations and constitution. Mm-hmm. And I think South Africa has that very well, strong. But I guess, there's nothing as powerful as active citizenry. In other words, get the citizens active. They raise their voices against things and they kind of push for certain ideas and so on and so on. And leaders will respond. But if society is sitting there and accepting everything, if you think about it, there are things that, think about load shedding or our electricity situation, as it were. It's like water, as a case in point. You get in some areas, people don't even get notification that water is going to be cut for 2 days. Who are fixing something, they don't get notification. And nobody complains. Say, I work over corner, and they continue with life, and so on and so on. And if you don't create a culture that says society stands up, it asks for questions, it asks for explanations, and on these kinds of things, as it were. It seeks to understand why are these things happening and how they are fixed. So if you don't create that culture, you are on the road towards a democracy with no accountability?
If it is to be, it is up to us. I think it starts with us going to vote. I urge each and every one of us to go and vote. Then, when you have voted, hold the state accountable. Let's complain. Let's make it happen. If you feel that the quality of your daughter or your son's education is not good, write a letter. Lobby others to write a letter. Tweet about it. Do what is necessary so we could see change in our lifetime. At the beginning of the book, Mr. Jonas states that we lost our youth. I can't comprehend what it would have taken for us to get here. And if you know of a cousin that is not getting the opportunities, the service, the basic services, health, we just can't be bystanders. Just because you're okay, it doesn't mean everybody's okay. And when everybody's not okay, we are all not okay. On that very hot, aching moment, I'm going to ask Mr. Jonas what he's currently reading.
I think the one interesting book I've been reading is a book titled Why Education is Uneducating. It's written by Frank Furedi. It's actually very insightful about education systems, as it were, and why education systems fall and collapse and become less effective, as it were. So it has been an interesting book, and it's very light and very in-depth, as it were, about what it says. Interestingly enough, I mean, before that, there's a book that I was reading. It says from Socrates to Twitter, you know, and again it talks about how public discourse has been dumbed down over the years, and it tries to explain what's underlying that. I mean, and okay, it's an interesting book again on its own because it deals with some of the stuff that we're talking about, as it were. And those are the main. I mean, there are kind of Sharma and Asemeglo on How Nation Fails and so on and so on. So those are a couple of them. But I would say that if you top the list,
Yeah.
Why Education is Uneducating is an interesting reading.
When you're not working, when you're not reading books, what do you do to unwind?
I kind of talk nonsense with friends.
Really?
I just walk around and talk nonsense with friends. I'm kind of like anybody, like normal time.
Thank you guys so very much. I would recommend that you all go get Mcebisi Jonas After Dawn, Hope After State Capture. He sparks a lot of questions, debate. He pokes holes. He opines. He gives you insights. He gives you real-time data. How long ago was the book written?
Oh, that's about 4 years ago, yeah.
It's still very much relevant, I think.
It is.
Would you change anything?
Yeah, I would. I guess, I mean, probably Ed. I mean, because I think the period post-Zuma is an interesting period because I think in the book at the early stages we talk about the danger of continuity of the state capture project in different forms. And my own argument is that part of what we actually argue is that we've got to understand the roots of it, and as we reimagine the new system, we actually take into cognizance the root of state capture, as it were. My own attitude is that I think corruption is on an increase, and
Still.
yeah, I don't think we're kind of dealing with it, and I don't think we've done a little bit well in terms of improving prosecution capability, etc. But I don't think we've been rigorous in pursuing the perpetrators of state capture and corruption as we're supposed to have done as a country. And again, I mean, the politics have not changed. I think our politics are still toxic, and too personified. I mean, like, it's almost like, I mean, we kind of have this tradition. We go from Mandela era to Thabo Mbeki era to Zuma era and Cyril era. So the danger with that is that we can't look at phases of leadership on the basis of structural change in society. We look at them on personality. And we end on personality, by the way, if you care to get my drift. And there's no, you can't say that structurally, what was Mandela era about? And did it achieve it? Of course it was. But then and I think it's because Mandela's personality was huge. And we then kind of use that as a signal. Whereas I think if we have to go deeper than that and say, in this phase, what are the structural changes that are happening, and how the structural changes are advancing the objective of building a better society. And I don't think we've done that. I mean, we've not done that. I mean, and so you have, and it produces a different kind of leadership, unfortunately. It produces a leadership that is so focused on themselves, so projecting themselves. So you can't define these phases in terms of big idea. So if you say, what is really the big idea of the Zuma era? And what is the big idea of this era, etc. So you're kind of gradually losing that kind of thing in leadership that you have. And then that's problematic. I mean, and as a result, underneath that, you continue with the things that are supposed to be stopped.
I'm going to challenge Mcebisi to continue speaking and writing and write articles on LinkedIn. So by the time he leaves here, I'm going to make sure he has a LinkedIn account. Do you promise me?
I do promise.
And in closing, he says, it is, of course, very difficult to transform any society without creating the conditions that generate jobs. If we do not drastically and sustainably reduce unemployment and increase the size of working population, the stability of the country will be threatened. My name, Mcebisi Jonas Unmasking. I'm the CEO and founder of Depoliticization Capital. We are your guide to building and sustaining a high-performance culture. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.